Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to Bible Breakdown, an overview and a guide on how to read and study the Bible with myself, Reverend Tara Gibbs. I'm so glad that you are joining us this evening. I have truly enjoyed providing this session, this information. It's been a joy and a good refresher for myself. So I'm thankful for the opportunity to share with you all. And let's go ahead and get started because today we are going to be covering the Bible and the timeline of the Bible. And that's going to take up a good bit of time. So I'm ready to get started here. So, again, welcome. This is Bible Breakdown. This is part 4 of our session on how to read and study the Bible. Okay? So, those who've been joining us before, we like to start with some terms that I believe you ought to know, terms that can help you understand as we read, as we study, as we learn together. Okay. Your assignment last week was to look up the definition of chronology. Chronology simply means the arrangement of dates and events. Okay. The arrangement of dates and events. So a timeline. If you're going to do the chronology of your life, you would set those events that have happened up in an orderly fashion based on their time. Okay. Now, I want to be clear that what we're going to do here today, when we talk about the chronology of the stories and events of the Bible, I don't want to focus too much on the actual dates and trying to date things because a lot of this is ancient history. It's lost to us. It's hard to get an exact date anyway. So what I'm going to try to provide for you today is just an overview so you can understand the order and the sequence of things and a general idea of the order of things. Okay. So another word, I don't want to assume people know definitions. So another word that I think or term is going to be helpful for you in our study is going to be the term exile, or when we use the adjective form exilic. Okay. So when we say exile, we're talking and referring about a forced absence from one's home country. Forced absence from one's home country. Okay. So we'll get to a point where you hear me talking about the exile of the Israelites, of the Hebrew people, right? You may hear me use the adjective forms exilic to refer to the exilic period. So that would be the period where they are away from their home country. Okay? Hopefully you're with me. Okay? And the last two terms, just to make sure we understand as when we go through this history, is that when we talk about Israel, Israel is not in the Bible the nation that we know it is today, not with a border, but we're talking about Israel as in the kingdom. Okay, of Israel, and at one time, there was a united kingdom that was called Israel, but then there was a split, and the kingdom of the north was continued to be called Israel, and the kingdom of the south was referred to as Judah. Okay, so North Israel, South Judah, United Israel. Okay, again, I don't like to make any assumptions that people knew this already, and a lot of it will become clearer as we continue to discuss this chronology. Okay, let's move on. Okay, so again, this week, what I want to do is do a very, very, very broad overview of the timeline of the Bible. And I cannot overemphasize what I mean very broad because again good portions of this what we're covering ancient history. Those who've been with me since week 1, remember we're talking about some um, BCE time before the Common Era, as well as going into the CE, the Common Era time. So literally millennia, okay, over thousands of years. So we won't be able to give you exact dates, but to give you an outline, okay? So here we go. Hopefully you are ready to go, buckled up, and ready to go with me on this journey. Okay. So I love this graphic by Ian Morrison. There's a number of graphics out there. I'm sure people have probably tried to Google before to get an idea of the timeline of scriptures um, to help get an order of what things look like. And some graphics were better than others, to be honest. Some are harder to follow, harder to read, and those who have been, particularly maybe my vacation Bible school class for adults this past summer, we talked about people's theology and people who make timelines. and their theology begins to show in the timeline. It wasn't just facts, but they were putting their own commentary on it. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but I want to get as unbiased view as possible just to give you the base line information, and then from there we can begin to talk about what that means for us in our faith, in our theology, in our beliefs. Okay, hopefully you're still with me. Okay, so here's this beautiful graphic. Again, credited to by Ian Morrison. And in this graphic, to give you just a guide, so it's just clearly a rainbow progression here, but we're starting from left to right to follow, remember, chronology. We're talking about a sequence of events across some time. So the far left is labeled creation near the center there, okay? And as we move to the right, we get to the new creation. Curious, right? How we start with creation, but then we end with a new creation. We'll come back to that because there is a pattern here, and that is something, again, that is a theology, a commentary on God's order of things, okay? But I love that at the top here, they also gave us some kind of titles to kind of see again that there are patterns and there are themes in the chronology of Scripture. That's something that God seems to operate in patterns and themes. They also make it easier for us to understand what the heck is going on. Okay, so as we go from left to right, from the creation all the way up to the new creation, we'll mention some of the books in the Bible along the way, so you can get an idea of the order. Okay, all right. So from the left, we would start with creation. Adam and Eve, of course, the very beginnings of the universe and how the universe was created. And I actually have some individual slides here too to show you each section. Let me see here. Here we go. Okay, so keep that graphic in mind. We will return to it. Okay, so first, when we're going left to right on that graphic, we have the creation and the fall. Okay, so the creation account saying, look, this is how what we know, what is, how it all came to be. Very, very important. Okay, it's the beginnings of things. Genesis meaning the beginning, the inception of things. Keep in mind that our faith starts the creation with the creation story, whereas there's some other faiths who have their own creation account, their own creation story. Okay, so here in Genesis, the creation, this is where humanity begins, but also where sin begins. Okay, so humanity enters the universe, but so does sin. This is what theologians, and this is the general overview, would call the fall, okay? When sin first enters into this state, this order. Remember from Genesis that God is creating order out of chaos, in a sense, out of disorder, and is creating some sort of order. However, that perfect, that ideal, that creation falls when sin is introduced, when Adam partakes in the fruit that he was instructed not to. Okay, and from there, theologians and academics and scholars and whatnot begin to see how sin just continues a line, right, up until when we get to the life of Jesus that needed to be quote corrected. Pastor Farrell just preached an excellent sermon that kind of explains that and talks about Jesus and the new Adam, and that Paul wrote about as well. So if you want to check that out from about 2 or 3 weeks ago, that would be an excellent source as well. Okay, so when you're reading the beginning of the Bible, so far you're good. That beginning is the beginning. Okay, but from there, then in Genesis, we get the stories of, oh, excuse me, let me go back. The creation and the fall, and those fall accounts, that would include the stories of the flood and Noah, Cain and Abel first, the flood and Noah, and the Tower of Babel. All stories that include sin being introduced into humanity, into the world, sin against people, one another, right? Cain and Abel, the sinful nature of humanity, where God destroys the world in Noah, and as well as the sin against God in general, right? This haughtiness that needed to be addressed that takes place in the Tower of Babel story. Okay, so creation, fall, boom. So the beginning, the Bible is actually the beginning. All right, then when you move further into Genesis, we get what we call the patriarchs. Patriarch, meaning the fathers, the head figures, the male head figures of the faith. Okay, so you're familiar with the names Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. Okay, so Abraham, you're familiar with the story, is called by God to leave his family, who he knows, his land. He's been chosen by God, and he's going to be the father of a chosen people. Okay, so Abraham is the patriarch, the beginning of that line. Abraham begets Isaac, Isaac begets Jacob, Jacob begets Joseph. Begat simply means offspring. Okay, so Abraham has Isaac, Isaac has Jacob, Jacob has Joseph. They have other children, okay, along the way in there. However, this is considered the quote line of that God is moving through. Okay, that's why you hear these names called. If some of you may have some of those old deacons or prayer warriors in your church, and you've heard them call on the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Okay, I always wonder why Joseph didn't get included, but he would be considered a patriarch as well. Okay, what's key to note here, and I'm going to come back to this, I have a good visual to show you, would be that so Abraham is in one area, moves to another area, Isaac, Jacob, then Joseph moves the line of genealogy towards Egypt. Okay, so they, the people of God, Abraham's line, are in one area in the Middle East. I'll show you on a map in a little bit. Just a little bit more east of present day Israel. Okay, because of Joseph's story, when you read in Genesis, there ends up in Egypt. Okay, that pretty much covers Genesis. Okay, so then Genesis, the second book of the Bible, goes right into Exodus. Okay, and if you look at Exodus, just in that very first chapter, there's a smooth transition from Genesis there, and when it opens with some lines that, and the new Pharaoh rises up in Exodus, right, in Egypt, a new leader who doesn't know Joseph. Okay, doesn't know about the people of Israel, doesn't know about this line, doesn't know about this lineage. Okay, so that ties right into Exodus, the story of Moses, right? And in Egypt, how he is raised up as a leader and how he is to lead the Exodus, the exit, the departure from Egypt for the Israelites, okay? Keep your eye on the Israelites. Remember, chosen people from God, descended from Abraham. Very, very important for them to keep that identity as their history progresses, and you'll see why, okay? Now, some of you may have saw the Prince of Egypt. Yay, they got out of Egypt. What happened next? That's what we read when you read further into Exodus, the last chapters of Exodus, and when you go into the next books of the Bible, Joshua and Judges. Okay, you see what happens. Scholars usually kind of call this section the conquest. Basically, going back again, that identity, being descendants of Abraham, Abraham was promised that he would have a multitude of generations under him and that he would be given a land for them. Okay? What land? Promised land. Why is it promised land? Because God promised it. It's their land. Well, this nation of people just left Egypt. Where's the promised land? God says, there it is. They look up, God, there are people there. And God says, okay, yeah, go ahead. Go get your land. Ta-da! And so we read what we call conquest stories about um, uh, uh, particularly Joshua leading the Israelites to take this land that was promised to them by God. And there's some very interesting conversations about that too, about what it means for God to address a people and say, okay, you need to fight these other people to get something I promised you. Very interesting conversations there. But that's the timeline of where we are now. Okay, so we've got the people of Israel now. They don't have a land. They are battling against other peoples, other groups that live in an area to get a land. Okay, they don't have a country. They don't have a nation. They don't have their own city. Really. Okay, they are nomads basically. Okay, they work towards getting this promised land. Okay, finally conquer the land. They're excited. They have a place. And then we begin to see in the book of Judges a cycle. Judges is known for its cycle of pretty much the short version is the people rebelling against God, right? Forgetting God. God having to send, a judge, which would be a leader, spiritual leader, guide to lead them and guide them. They reject the judge at some point. which means they reject God. There is some kind of destruction, some kind of punishment, right? Um, they repent, they ask God for forgiveness. God indeed forgives, and then they're back at square one. It's a cycle, okay? Happens over and over and over again, okay? For some generations. All right, then there's a break in the judges. Many of you may already know about Samuel, who is known as the last judge, okay, of Israel, because the people say, you know what, we want a king. There are other nations around us, other people, and they have kings. They don't have judges that come in and out, that are appointed and then die, and then there's another one appointed at some other time. They have kings. We want a king. So they desired a king, and God said, great, I will give you a king. And so they get a king. Okay. So this the kingdom of Israel, in a sense, is one known as the United Kingdom. There's some skirmishes and some other back and forth things, but for the most part, they're known as the United Kingdom. Okay. Now keep in mind, God is disappointed because God is like, well, I was your leader. I'm your king. You didn't need an earthly leader. But the people say we want to be like the others. Yes, we do. Okay. God said, well, you'll see how that works out. And we will see how that works out. Saul is the first king of Israel. Okay. After Saul comes David. Okay. Probably easily the most popular, well-known king of Israel. Okay. Then Solomon. After Solomon, oh, it gets messy. It gets ugly. After Solomon, then is when the kingdom divides. Very, very interesting story. But it's not no surprise. It's because Solomon's got some kids and they got some disagreements about how things are to be run. Okay. So then is what we call that divided kingdom. Remember from our terms to know, it's that divided kingdom, what we're talking about here, where the north part of Israel becomes known as Israel. The southern part becomes known as Judah. Okay. Northern Israel, south is Judah. All considered God's people, or Israel in a sense as a whole, but they're divided. Okay. So when you start getting into First and Second Kings, First and Second Chronicles, as you're reading, as you're studying, you'll notice that there are references to the Northern Kingdom. They'll say straight out Northern Kingdom, or sometimes they'll say Israel. Other times they will say Judah, okay, or the Southern Kingdom. And that's letting you know what's going on. And we're still in God's chosen people of Israel in a sense, but there may be two kings at one time, okay? And these kings don't always get along. Sometimes they do. So there's things happening, a lot of good monarchy drama going on in First and Second Kings as well as First and Second Chronicles. Okay. Also keep in mind during this time there are still prophets in the land. So when you start reading in those same books about prophets like Elijah, okay, that is happening at the time of this kingdom. Okay, this divided kingdom. Okay, and there were some prophets who were in the north, and there were some prophets in the south. Okay, so keep that in mind. Hopefully you're still with me. Now, kings, temples, this image here is actually a model of the second temple. Keep in mind, remember, when they were doing a lot of that moving, they were nomads, the people didn't have their own place. One of the first things they needed to do when they got settled was, we need to build a temple. We need a place, a stable place to worship, right? And they built a temple. But there are some other nations around who like their land. Anybody who knows and understands the geography, that this is taking place in the Middle East, it's some good land surrounded by fertile land, a lot of natural water, good farming, irrigation. These are really, really nice areas, okay? So other countries, other empires want this land. And unfortunately, the northern kingdom of Israel, falls to the Assyrians. Okay, the Assyrian Empire takes over the north. They did not get the south. So as you read, you realize that the north is taken over by the Assyrians, and their people are sent into what we call exile. Okay, remember that term to know, exile. The Israelites are taken from their home country. Okay, then later the south falls to the Babylonians. The Babylonian Empire took over and takes the south, and also takes the north, and takes a lot of other areas as well. And then at another point, then Persia comes in and takes over both the areas again. Okay, that's when you start to get into the books of Esther, for example. Esther is married to the Persian king. Okay, so a lot of history, really, really interesting stuff. But I'm trying to give you an overview so as you read, you know what's happening and where we're going from one place to the next. Okay, now all of course, all of this happens over centuries, decades. A lot of time passes. So, the people of Israel, I'm talking about the people overall of Israel, the chosen people, they are exiled but permitted to return, rebuild kind of their temple, in a community in a sense, as to not be prisoners. Now, they would still be under rule of another people, but to have some more freedom in their own area. Okay, this is where you're starting to get into the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. Okay, their is returning, their focus is rebuilding. Okay, where do we build? Where do we return? Okay, so that covers kings and temples. Okay, now as you read your Bibles, of course, after how your Bible is probably organized after Ezra and Nehemiah, there are more books. However, if you remember from our genres conversation, those books are not necessarily narratives, but they are wisdom and prophetic books that are taking place during that history that we just talked about. Okay. Also, there's some more history that takes place before we get to the New Testament. Again, if you remember from last week, we have the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, the New Testament, and in between there, we call this the intertestamental period. Intertestamental period. It simply just means between the testaments. That's all it means. And in this period, there are some things that happen. Now, a lot of the writings we don't have, as with most of the Bible, we don't have the originals, but a lot of parts of this are not included in our Bible canon. They're not included in what we regard as the Bible today. Okay? One big portion of that history that happens, that's not recorded in our Bible canon, is the book of, I think it's just First and Second Maccabees, and it is basically about a revolt. Okay, remember these Israelites, these Hebrew people. Okay, that at some point they become known as the Jews. Okay, the Jewish people. They are still they kind of have their own area. They're allowed to kind of do their own thing, right? Worship their God, but they are still under the authority of an empire. They don't have their own complete land and country. Okay, and so at some point there are some revolts, there are some revolutions, and they try to get their freedom, get their land, and a lot of that takes place in the intertestamental period, as well as during the early life of Jesus. Those things are still happening, and I believe even after Jesus' death and resurrection, there's still some war and some battles and things going on for who is in charge, basically. Okay, you might even notice as you get to the New Testament when you get confused about hearing who's in charge, you're like, is Pilate in charge? Is Herod in charge? Who's in charge here? Okay, is the high priest in charge? Who's in charge? The questions you have were questions that other people had too at the same time. Okay, so the intertestamental period got some history, got some revolts, things going on. Then, Jesus is born. Okay, so we get to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Remember, they don't happen back to back as they are placed in the Bible, but they are different accounts of the same of Jesus's life. Okay, so the life of Jesus, death, resurrection, Jesus is born, Jesus lives, Jesus dies, Jesus is resurrected. But also then we go directly into the birth of the church. Okay, how did the church start? When Jesus died, there wasn't a manual that just said, okay, now this is how you do church. Now this is what it means to be a church and do church. But they had to figure that out. And this is when you start reading about Paul and some others, Peter's, their missionary journeys as they're spreading the gospel, as they are growing the church. Remember, Paul's writing to different churches, okay, that were planted. Okay, he's writing to the church in Rome. He's writing to the church in Thessalonica. Okay, he's writing to the church in Corinth. Okay, so that's what's happening at that time period. Okay, and then of course in the Bible, that's kind of it. Then we get to Revelation, but that is, if you remember from last week too, prophetic in a sense. It is an apocalypse. It's talking about some end things that are to be. Okay. Now, I actually have a video, very quick clip, but I want to show you just a second. But let me come back. Let's make this full circle. Okay. So this is what we just did. Whew. And it took a good bit of time too. We just did a quick walkthrough. Again, here's this image by Ian Morrison of what was happening overall, timeline wise, from the beginning, the far left on the image, okay, the creation, to the apocalypse of Revelation, which we'll call the new creation, okay? So from the creation, far left, okay, could be called the pattern of the kingdom. This is what God intends. This is that paradise, right? But then you move to the right, the next screen, the perished kingdom. There's a fall, okay? Humanity, there's sin. Cain kills Abel. There's the flood that needs to happen. Noah and his issues that happened, the Tower of Babel and having to scatter the people, okay? Then there's the promised kingdom. You get to that first blue. So that promise, very important, that Abrahamic identity, being connected to Abraham, okay, being a part of Abraham's lineage, which you know if you when you start reading your New Testament, is even connected to Jesus. They're able to change Jesus all the way back here. Okay, the patriarchs. This is that period where there's a promised kingdom, and we're gonna get there. And then we get to the light blue, the partial kingdom. So we're partly there. We're partly there to what God is kind of intended. However, we've got to get God's people free. We got to get to this promised land. That's when you're reading in Exodus, you're reading about the plagues and the spilling of the Red Sea and the commandments given at Mount Sinai and Moses dying and Joshua and the wandering in the wilderness for years and years. But then they finally get to this promised land and they're covered by judges because they keep doing that cycle of sinning and repenting and sinning and repenting and sinning and repenting. Okay, then they're a little bit further in the purple. Now they're in the even more partial kingdom. It's coming together to some extent. It's still partial though because it's not God's ideal. They have kings, they have a temple. This is when you get Samuel, Saul, David, Solomon, because this is God's people united. Uh-oh, boom, split. Okay, there's a split between the north and the north being Israel, the south being Judah. Okay, I'm in the red now for those following along, the kind of purplish red there. The prophesied kingdom. This is a time when the prophets are very, very active in the history of God's people here, okay? During talking to these kings, if you read the prophets, you'll see how they start to talk to different kings, and a lot of their prophetic writings will start within a year of King so and so. Okay, and the north kingdom of Israel is exiled to Assyria. The Assyrians take over, okay, and the south eventually they're destroyed as well, okay, in Judah, but they are sent back. There's an opportunity to kind of come back to kind of create that identity, reestablish their identity for themselves, even though, remember, they still don't have a homeland, not their own place to be safe. They're still run by outsiders, by empires, okay? Then we get to the red, which was known as the present kingdom, right? Because that's when the kingdom of God was at hand. Jesus was on earth, right? So we have Jesus' birth, his life, death, resurrection, okay? Then the proclaimed kingdom, okay? The birth of the church. Jesus is dead and resurrected. He's given the great commission. Paul and others are spreading the gospel. They are starting churches. Churches are growing. Followers are growing, okay? And then you get to the perfected kingdom, which we're not there yet. But again, it's full circle, known as the new creation, because we're getting to a place, and hopefully, and we're trusting and having faith in God to come to a place where it's coming full circle, where we're going to see a new creation, right? Remember in Revelation, behold, I saw a new heaven and a new earth. Okay, we're getting back to God's ideal of perfection for humanity. All right. Whew. Everyone, take a deep breath right here. Even if it's just me, take a deep breath right here. Okay, I'd love to see if you have any questions about this. Again, very general overview. It might be helpful for you to try to save this image, that as you read, you kind of have an idea of what's happening timeline wise. Remember, this is a chronology. We're trying to just go and cover a general timeline. I didn't hit on dates or exact locations too often, but I really want to just give you an overview of what God is up to. Okay, what was God up to? Thank you, Sister May Paul. I'm tired already. Before I wrap up, though, because I don't want to, I was hoping to go into translations, but this is enough for today. And next week, I will cover translations and some general tips on how to study and read the Bible. that would be our wrap up. I do have a video that I want to show you that again might just give you a little bit of idea of how uh, the history of Israel is so messy. It's messy, okay? And you'll understand why when we talk about the Middle East, why it's so messy now, okay? So, won't you watch with me here? Let's see. Okay. And history. Oops. History. Come on, video. All right, here we go. All right, so timeline at the bottom, give us a general idea. It's a little fuzzy, but all right. So in the early parts of the universe and the world, Kingdom of Egypt got started early. You all know this, right? Advanced society, very advanced civilization. Notice that they are able to control what is modern day Egypt, those kind of gray lines, the more squarish looking areas, but also that kind of north little horn antenna thing up there to the right, that is where modern day Israel is. Okay, modern day, because again, it didn't exist then. But that's where the kingdom of Egypt, okay? They got a lot of ground to cover. All right. So time progresses, boom, 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 we're in the BCE still. The Hittite Empire exists, okay? The Hittite Empire pretty much covers all of those um, nations that when you read Genesis, you keep reading about all these different people attacking Israel. So Israel, Abraham and them are in that light yellow there from Egypt, still trying to get their lives together, okay, as best they can. And you read a lot about a bunch of these different nations attacking all the time. Okay, just trying to attack them. The kingdom is trying to come together, but they get attacked a lot. And a lot of them are from different factions of the Hittite Empire. Okay. Uh-oh, this nice little purple established the kingdom of Israel. Yay. So after Joshua and them are still fighting and they finally get this promised land, we get this kingdom of Israel that's united. It's run by kings Saul, uh, David, Solomon. All right. But of course, eventually they get to their own split, but they'll work that out. Okay, notice, all right, Hittites fall, they move on. But always notice there's always another kingdom coming up. Boom, the Assyrians move in that blue. They take over, remember, Assyrians take over the northern kingdom of Israel, but they didn't take the southern kingdom of Judah. So Judah is all that's left, that little purple smidgen there, okay? The Assyrians are running stuff now, okay? The Egypt begins to fade out. Now the Babylonians are creeping in. Babylonians are not only taking Assyria, but watch this, boom, they took that southern kingdom as well, okay? Remember, as we read some of the texts, when you start getting into particularly Daniel and Esther, you'll see what happens next here. So the Babylonians are in charge now, right? Boom. Now the Persians are coming in. Persians are coming in and they are taking a huge swath of land there, okay? And they are kicking out the Babylonians. They're running stuff. The Babylonians are trying to hold on. Now we zoomed out a little, but I want you to keep an eye still on this area here. Remember where the kingdom of Israel was? Those people still exist, okay? They're just run by Persians, okay? Esther in particular marries a Persian king, as I mentioned. And then of course some are scattered throughout. But keep an eye on the same area here. For those who don't know, just keep in mind, according to our real maps, this would be like modern day Egypt, modern day Turkey, modern day Saudi Arabia. This is where we are. Modern day Iran. Okay? All right, a little further, a little further. Okay? Uh-oh. Blue come in. I wonder who that is. That would be the Macedonian Empire. That would be Alexander the Great. The Greek Empire, basically. Okay? Now, what's important to note here is that even though as you see clearly, Macedonia Greek Empire is the biggest at this time that we've seen in terms of land covering this area. They clearly have an expansive empire. What they did uniquely, and it's important to understand too, is that they also didn't just conquer with power, but they began to really pump their culture, okay, into everything. That's why we still think about the classics and classic that classic time, classic architecture and styles and poetry and readings and things like that, because they really influenced the culture to the point that we call it the Hellenistic period. Okay, the Hellenists. Okay, we are covering that Greek period. Their culture remains pervasive even when this next empire takes on. Okay, so my history buffs may appreciate knowing that and keeping that in mind. Okay, so there's another empire that's going to outdo the Macedonians. Some of you may have guessed. Did you see where it came from there? Did you see? Can you guess what empire that's going to be? coming out of Italy, what's modern day Italy. It is the Roman Empire. Now, wow, look at Rome. Roman Empire covering Europe, Northern Africa, Middle East here, parts of Asia. Okay, Roman Empire came in, running everything. Now, keep in mind what I just mentioned. The Hellenist, the Greek Empire was still very strong culturally, even though the Romans are ruling things right now. So now we're in the age of when Jesus would have been born and lived under the Roman Empire. Okay, but remember, our Israelites are still exist. People still exist. They're still in this area. Okay, but they are under Roman rule, and it's not an easy thing to quote escape. This is why um, Jesus was executed by the Roman Empire. Okay, this is why even when Paul comes on the scene, he's a Roman citizen. Okay, now I'm not going to stop so much for this next portion because these are empires that are a little bit beyond the Bible. But just to give you some idea, I will finish it out for those who just want to see um, how history plays out here. The Byzantine Empire. So look, we're in the couple early centuries of the existence of the world, CE. The Byzantine Empire, important to note here, Constantine is the emperor. He is in charge. And Constantine is the one who says, hey, y'all that were Christian and you were hiding out in homes and being secretive about being followers of the way because you won't get killed and whatnot. Yeah, Christianity is legal now. That's cool. Okay, Christianity is legal. Because I want to know, see all this purple here? Oh, here we go. People think Christianity existed only in for people of color after the slave trade. Not true. Look at here, okay? Southern part of the Iberian Peninsula, tip here, that's where Morocco is, and here, Northern Africa, okay? Thank you, Deacon King, Derek King there. I love geography as well, too. It's so fascinating and helps us understand what's happening. Here, this is the tip of, this is Northern Africa. Christianity in Northern Africa. There it is. Christianity existed in Africa before the slave trade. You've heard it said Christianity existed in Africa before the slave trade. Just need to put that out there because it kind of bothers me when people don't know that. All right, so I'm gonna let this kind of run so you can just kind of see as we get closer up to the 2000s. The Sassanid Empire, okay, this is when a lot of Muslim influence began, and especially with the Caliphate. And then you see why a lot of those same countries are still Muslim today, okay. The Seljuk Empire, again, if you notice, that same little area has been so many different colors. The Crusades, okay, fight for Christianity over to Islam, but then Islam coming back with Saladin. You see why there's so much conflict in this area, okay? When we talk about wars in the Middle East, this little area here, how many colors have you seen it be so far, okay? Get ready to wrap up the Ottoman Empire. So just before World War One, the Ottoman Empire fell during World War One. Okay, European colonization starting to come in, taking over, running a lot of stuff. Now those borders are established. Now people are saying here is where my country ends and yours begins. And the state of Israel, as we know it today, is founded and given a home. Okay, remember they didn't have their own country. People forget how new Israel is as a nation compared to other countries that have been around for centuries. Okay, and now a lot of these countries in the Middle East, again, where we see a lot of conflict and things, as they began to be independent from their colonizers. So here's the quick little recap. Watch Jerusalem, watch those colors. Look at that. How many empires, how many different groups have taken over that area? Wow. Fascinating, fascinating stuff. That map was brought to you by Maps of War. I can give you that website if you'd like to go look at it for yourself. I don't know if it plays online anymore. I had to download it, but I appreciate that video. Okay, my time's winding up here, folks, but I hope you have a better understanding now of the history of kind of what was happening. I know, and I'll admit, when I was probably in high school, I really had a hard time understanding history, things that were happening in the Bible, and history that was happening in my textbooks, right? Like it just didn't cross in my mind. Those were completely separate things. But I, as the scripture says, I don't want you to be ignorant, brethren, brethren and sisters, that to understand that the things that we read about in history, in a secular history or world history and things, were affecting those in the Bible. Things that were happening in the biblical times were affected by world history. These things were all happening in conjunction, in tandem, parallel at some points. They're all crisscrossing, all happening together. And that's very helpful as we begin to understand the Bible. What we mean when we say that Jesus was born under the Roman Empire. That's what we're talking about. You saw how much red they took over at one point. This is what we're talking about when we're talking about David running the kingdom of Israel, trying to keep it from falling apart, because not long after him, it does fall apart and splits into two. Okay, and then when we start getting into Daniel, Esther, Ezra, we're talking about this exile period. This is what it means when we understand our history and why we need to study our Bible. Thank you all so much for your generous compliments. I love this stuff. I think it's very fascinating, but also just opens our eyes up as we read. And I just thank you all for listening in. So don't forget to join us next week. Will be our final week, unfortunately, for our Bible breakdown. We've had a good time, but I really want to be specific, and I want to make sure that we talk about some translations, because a lot of people are like, good, I'm excited, I'm ready to read. Which translation do I get, right? Which one do I pick up? So I want to talk about that, and I'll be happy to give you what I'm going to be real clear about my opinion, all right? Because if you read the Bible, I'm going to be grateful regardless of what you read. You're reading the Bible, I'm grateful and I'm glad. You studying, I'm grateful and glad. But I will also be very intentional and say, this is my opinion. This is what I do. Doesn't mean what you have to do. So we'll talk about that. I'll even give you some study guides, and now you can read some tips on where to start, or what strategies may work best for you and your learning style. Okay? So here's your assignment, and I can't check to see if you did this or not, but I'm going to encourage you to find a partner. Find you a partner. Could be a friend, could be another church member, could be a sibling, co-worker, and just hook up with that friend. Commit to reading and studying and discussing with one another on a regular basis in October. Okay? Reading your Bible, whether you read together, whether you read separately, then talk later, whether you just shoot each other a message on accountability about, hey, did you read this, or let's read this together. I think that it will just really bless you, to just have that accountability partner, have someone to discuss these things with. The Bible was never meant to be read completely in a closet separately, okay? So I want you to get you a partner. You got, what, a week and a half to get you a partner for the month of October. I want you to get someone that you can read with, someone that will ask you if you've been reading, someone you can ask questions of, okay? God bless you. Thank you so much. Please keep in mind that at Reader, we love and appreciate you, but we also appreciate when you donate to our ministries. We have a lot of things still happening at Reader. We appreciate your donations anytime, anything that you have to give. The options to give are on the screen for you. Also want to mention another announcement. Our revival is coming up. We're really excited for our virtual fall revival. Our theme is in this season. In this season. Oof. There's a lot of answers or responses or follow-ups to that. In this season, what's God doing? In this season, what does God want from me? In this season, how can I stay faithful? Wow. So we're really excited. We hope you can join us. The dates are there for you, October 4th to the 7th. We have our very own associate member ministers who are already, just sharing some great things today that God has given them. They're excited. We're excited. And we look forward to it. So that being said, thank you all. Uh-oh, I'm up here somewhere. All right, there, so I can say bye to your face. Thank you all. Have a great night. Continue